Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Entre naranjo y la cao. Ay, 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 ay.
I saw Christ walking up this street. His tunic was swaying, and it really looked like he was walking.
We see them move out of the chapels and through the streets with this human gait.
They fill you with such a strong emotion that it doesn't matter if you don't eat or sleep.
And everyone's yelling, "Ole" and "Viva!"
For the greater glory of God, we go out on Good Friday, accompanying an image that represents to us the way to our spiritual health, bearing with all veneration a most holy Christ, after whom all the brothers follow. And at the end of the procession, we carry an image of Our Lady, the most holy Virgin, so that by carrying Jesus Christ as captain before our eyes, and with our backs protected by His Divine Mother, we will be free of the demon.
These words, written in the year 1570, are from the rulebook of a Catholic confraternity in Seville, Spain. They describe a ritual that has been observed in Seville every Easter for nearly 5 centuries. The processions of the penitential brotherhoods during Semana Santa. Every year during Semana Santa, under the full moon of the vernal equinox, the city is transformed into a moving tableau of religious scenes. Life-size images of Christ and the Virgin are carried through the streets. Seville sits on the banks of the Guadalquivir River in southern Spain. The capital of Andalusia, it is one of the oldest cities in Europe. Its varied and illustrious past dates back to the ancient Phoenicians.
Si tú te vas, yo me quedo en Sevilla y hasta el final. Si tú te vas, yo me quedo en Sevilla hasta el final. Ahí nomás, compadre, para que tú la goces. Que yo te doy a ti la mitad de perejil. Que yo te doy a ti la mitad de perejil. Que yo te doy a ti la mitad de perejil. La mitad de perejil. Que yo te doy a ti la mitad de perejil. Que yo te doy a ti la mitad de perejil. Que yo te doy a ti la mitad de perejil. La mitad de perejil.
The Moors from North Africa invaded the city in the beginning of the 8th century. Their 500-year reign left a lasting mark on Seville. When King Fernando III reconquered the city in 1248, he destroyed the Great Mosque. He built Seville's magnificent Gothic cathedral over its ruins. But he couldn't bear to destroy the minaret. Today, the Giralda is the symbol of Seville. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella established a permanent tribunal of the Inquisition in Seville in 1480. Autos de fe, or pageants of faith, were held in front of the cathedral and in the Plaza de San Francisco. The sentences handed down to suspected heretics were pronounced at these grand public events. Every year, hundreds were burned at the stake. In 1492, the Moors suffered their final defeat at the hands of Ferdinand and Isabella. That same year, Columbus departed on his first voyage to the New World. Riches from the Americas, gold, silver, and tobacco, brought newfound wealth and power to Seville. During the 16th century, Northern Europe was swept by the Reformation. While the cry for austerity rang through the churches of Germany, Switzerland, and Holland, the altars of Seville were being adorned with gold and elaborate polychrome sculpture. Semana Santa begins on Palm Sunday, the day Christ entered Jerusalem. It continues through his condemnation, his agonizing walk dragging the cross to Calvary, and his slow death on the cross. This is the Passion of Christ. It culminates on Easter, Sunday of the Resurrection. The hosts of this grand celebration are the penitential brotherhoods or confraternities. There are more than 50 of these organizations in Seville. Many of them date back to the 14th and 15th centuries. They are the keepers of the images. They are the ones who prepare the Passos every year. It is the brothers themselves who carry the heavy platforms through the narrow, winding streets of the city. Other members, dressed in tunics and hooded masks, accompany the images throughout the procession. They are called Nazarenos. The processions of Semana Santa go on day and night for a full week. More than 100 processional platforms, called Passos, and tens of thousands of Nazarenos fill the streets. The official processional route begins at each brotherhood's home church. From there they go through the cathedral in the center of the town, where they are reviewed by the Archbishop. Then they return to their home church. It can take up to 16 hours to cover the entire route.
I can imagine that for many Americans, these processions might seem somewhat sinister, since most of us cannot help but think of the KKK when we look at these processions passing through the streets. And yet, the KKK adopted these robes, and the penitential confraternities of Seville have absolutely no relationship to the KKK whatsoever.
Claro, sin duda, la Semana Santa de Sevilla es un producto de siglos.
There's no doubt that Semana Santa in Seville is a product of centuries. It goes back to the time King Fernando III reconquered Seville from the Arabs in the middle of the 13th century. The first thing he did was convert the mosques to churches, the triumph of the cross over the crescent moon. And almost immediately, although there are no historical records that date that far back, came the tradition of penitential brotherhoods from the northern kingdom of Castile.
Sí, bueno, brevemente se puede decir que los principios de la religiosidad popular y también de la
Expressions of religious piety by ordinary people began in the Middle Ages. At that time, the mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans promoted this movement. They wanted the people who had become very removed from the official church to come back. So they introduced a series of devotional practices, like the Stations of the Cross. By participating in these rituals, the people could understand and experience and identify with Jesus, who suffered and died on the cross. From then on, it was the people themselves, independent of the religious orders, who took over the movement. They were active participants in these rites, and they began to organize what were the beginnings of Semana Santa.
Some brotherhoods evolved from the guilds of the 14th and 15th centuries. Each guild, such as the Coachman's or the Tanner's Guild, had a spiritual patron. Wood sculptures of Christ and the Virgin were commissioned by the brothers. Soon, devotional cults developed around these images. Other brotherhoods were formed by groups of outsiders who had immigrated to Seville, where they became easy targets of persecution. These confraternities protected their members from the distrust of the townspeople and, ultimately, from the Inquisition. The Brotherhood of the Gypsies, or Los Gitanos, is one confraternity which was formed as a result of persecution.
La Hermandad de los Gitanos data del 1753.
The Brotherhood of Los Gitanos was founded in 1753. At that time, gypsies couldn't belong to any of the established brotherhoods. The doors were closed to them simply for being gypsies. Gypsies were looked down upon. They were called people of the bad life. Since the other doors were closed, they created their own brotherhood. For an outcast population that is persecuted, it's easy to see how they would be attracted to the image of Christ, who was so poor, so humiliated, so persecuted and punished. The people could relate to this.
The Brotherhoods of Seville built hospitals and offered community assistance. Since much of the population was illiterate, the processional images of the Brotherhoods provided an educational medium for teaching the story of Jesus. The confraternities commissioned the great artists of the time to create elaborate, lifelike sculptures. Their purpose was not merely to teach, but to move the spectator to prayer and devotion. 500 years later, the same sculptures are carried through the streets of Seville. The people are still deeply moved.
Y ciertamente, desde que los niños nacen,
from the time they're born, parents bring their children to the processions and say, "Look, there's our Lord dying. Throw him a little kiss." Or, "Look at the Virgin crying. See how she suffers." Or they explain a paso with Pilate. For example, the presentation of Jesus to the people. They explain how Pilate dealt with Christ, how Herod despised him, and yet Christ said nothing. Parents explain the entire passion to their children. So early on, these children get a visual catechism. They even develop an affection for these sculptures.
A 17th century Sevillian abbot wrote that a man must have three things: a house in which to live, a sepulchre in which to be buried, and a confraternity which gives him honor. This sentiment remains strong in modern-day Seville.
Las cofradías tienen dos funciones principales, que son la función original, fundacional.
Today, the Brotherhoods have two main functions. One is to worship God via devotional practices to the images. The second is to give social assistance to the needy or to institutions. There are Brotherhoods that attend to the sick, the unemployed, drug addicts, and the elderly.
The penitential confraternities began as flagellant brotherhoods who whipped themselves in public in these processions during Holy Week. And dating from probably the 15th century and throughout the 16th and 17th century, the vast majority of participants in these Holy Week processions would be wearing robes with the backs open so that they could whip themselves and splatter blood on the passersby. And it was part of a very visceral part of the penitential procession, which now no longer occurs because it was prohibited during the Enlightenment in the late 18th and early 19th century. So we see no flagellants in the processions today, and instead what we see are the penitentes who carry the crosses, and that serves as a similar kind of penitential act.
Hundreds of Nazarenos go barefoot. Some carry not just one, but many crosses strapped together.
For the Nazarenos that participate in these processions in Seville, these costumes, these garments that they wear that cover their faces and their bodies, represent penitence and humility. And the people in Seville have a great deal of respect for the appearance of the Nazareno, since it is such an expression of piety and true penitence.
Each brotherhood has its own special tunic and identifying colors.
La túnica, lleve o no lleve capa, es un hábito.
The tunic, with or without a cape, is a habit. It is directly related to the clothing of a monk or a crusader of the Middle Ages.
El antifaz. El antifaz tiene dos explicaciones muy claras.
The mask or antifaz is for anonymity. The Nazareno is doing his penance and no one needs see him. No one needs to know who's behind the eyes. The dunce cap, or capirote, could come from, no one knows for sure, but it has two possible origins. One is humility. As the tunic is a reminder of the religious aspect of this moment, the capirote is to make them humble in front of everyone. Until not so long ago, they used the dunce cap in school to punish slow or unruly children. On the other hand, and perhaps in the same way, or dating from the same period, they put capirotes on people who were condemned by the Inquisition and paraded them in the street. Of course, they went with their faces uncovered. It was important to see the faces of the condemned. But the capirote meant the same thing, bad, sinner. In the same sense, the Nazareno doing his penance has sinned. He is repentant. I also like to think that Seville has a poetic explanation for the capirote. It makes the penitent grow in physical stature in the same way that he grows morally while doing his penance.
Pues para mí la Semana Santa es un tiempo de oración, un tiempo de reencuentro, de poder...
For me, Semana Santa is a time of prayer, of self-discovery, to be able to think privately. Because we live in a big city where, like in all big cities, we're always running around, rushing. But during this time, you can take time out and think your private thoughts. It allows you to look at the city in a different way. You go through the city, thinking, meditating, and the people seem to forget you're a person. You're just another Nazareno. So you can listen to conversations as if you were invisible. You have a completely different relationship with the city than usual.
Cuando salgo primero me visto, después vengo para acá, para la iglesia y ya...
First, I put on my tunic. Then I go to my church and get a candle and get in line. Then we go out in the street. If we get tired, we can leave. And we pray to Christ when we need to.
Y en ese tiempo da lugar a pensar.
You have time to think about a lot of things. In my case, I always remember my ancestors, who aren't here anymore, who once walked in the same places I'm walking now. It's a chance for self-study, to look back at the year gone by. Once a year, you repeat the same actions. You pass the same places. It helps you to reflect on the past year. Was it good? Bad? Average? What conclusions can you draw? What can you do to make things better in the future?
Most brotherhoods allow their women members to go out as Nazarenas. There are many brotherhoods, however, who still forbid it. Dr. Maria Milagros Ciudad Suarez is a member of the Brotherhood of La Iniesta. She is also the only woman in Seville who is a member of the governing board of her brotherhood.
Las mujeres siempre han podido ser hermanas de las cofradías. Lo que pasa que no tenían.
Women have always been allowed to be brothers since the beginning of the brotherhoods, but they didn't have the same obligations or rights as the men. The important thing isn't to go out as a Nazarena or not to go out. The important thing is that women become totally integrated. That is, women should be able to attend the general assemblies and speak and vote. They should be able to hold an official office in the government. That is fundamental.
The women of Seville have an old and special tradition. The mantilla dates back to hundreds of years before Christ.
La mantilla es una prenda que se usa en España y en Sevilla desde hace muchos años. Y la mantilla negra.
The mantilla has been worn in Spain and Seville for many years. The black mantilla is for mourning. It's especially used on Holy Thursday for the death of Jesus Christ. I inherited this mantilla and comb from my grandmother who wore them. The earrings and this ring I'm wearing too, which is why I like to wear them so much, in remembrance of my grandmother. I'd like for my daughter and granddaughter to wear them one day.
Semana Santa takes away the walls of the church and brings the congregation into the street. While some Sevillanos flee to the beach to escape the crowds, outsiders come to Seville to bear witness to Semana Santa. 1 million tourists from all over the world flood the city.
Durante la Semana Santa prácticamente se duerme poquísimo, 4, 5 horas, 6 horas según el día.
During Semana Santa, you hardly sleep. 4, 5, 6 hours a day. There are special nights of Semana Santa, like Thursday and Friday, when you stay up all night. In spite of all the enthusiasm, there have been, through the centuries, those who do not share this excitement. Some call it fanaticism, others idolatry. A Sevillano named Rodrigo de Cervantes wrote in 1592,
They entertained themselves watching the brotherhoods and are kept from being able to go into the churches and pray with tranquility and calm, because there are so many brotherhoods going by all Holy Thursday, from midday until the next night, Good Friday. And in addition to the lack of devotion, this results in a great tumult of people.
Each brotherhood has up to 3 pasos. Some bear an image of Christ. Others feature the Virgin under a canopy or palio. Pasos de Misterio depict a scene from the Passion. La Canina is the only allegorical paso of Semana Santa. Dating from the 17th century, it symbolizes death, Christ's death, which left the world in darkness for 3 days, and the death of the earth in winter. It harkens back to pagan rites of spring, which, like Semana Santa, were imbued with the cyclical theme of life, death, and rebirth. Underneath the pasos are crossbars which settle on the necks of the costaleros. Once the work of hired dockhands from the port of Seville, it is now the brothers themselves who carry these heavy loads. Nobody can say how much they weigh, but estimates average at 1 ton or more. In rotating shifts, the costaleros carry the pasos for many kilometers. Injuries are not uncommon, but most are surprisingly minor. The neck is what suffers most. Juan Luis has been a costalero for his brotherhood, La Sed, for 11 years. His wife, Victoria, follows him for the entire 15-hour procession.
It all started with a promise my grandmother made to God that I would be a costalero. So I went under the paso, and I'm still here today. I like it. So here I am. When I'm under the paso, I think of my daughter, my mother, my wife, everything. I think about God so I can keep going when I get tired.
The capataz is the leader of the costaleros. the one who directs their movements and their steps.
The men under the paso can't see because of the curtains covering them. So we're like the eyes of the costalero. We usually begin a couple of months before Semana Santa. We start lining up and forming the teams of costaleros. Then we go out in the streets with the pasos, without the ornamentation, without the Virgin or the Christ, just the parihuela, which is the support frame.
It is also his job to encourage them, to cheer them on when their strength starts to wane.
Todos por igual, valiente. ¡Échale! ¡Destrozo!
Supone sobre todo un efectismo, es decir,
in the Baroque period, effect was very important. They wanted the spectators to feel, to respond to the images they saw in the street. So they tried to make them as expressive as possible. These are images which inspire devotion.
All of these sculptures were designed to evoke an emotional response from the spectator in the street. And to that end, they were often equipped with glass eyes and tears and wigs of actual hair. Clothing and actual clothing and adornments, so that they could evoke a much more realistic presence, a much more visceral aspect for the spectator in the street. And there are numerous recorded instances in chronologies of the 16th and 17th centuries that describe onlookers falling to their knees in prayer and weeping at the approach of a processional sculpture.
Antoine de la Tour, a French traveler of the mid-19th century, was fascinated by the response of the Sevillanos.
On a platform covered with flowers, there lay a transparent box that permitted a vision of the body of the Redeemer. With the appearance of the divine image, the crowd demonstrated a profound and sincere spiritual absorption, all profane thoughts fleeing from their minds, kneeling with their hands stretched out towards Christ. They had found the faith of olden times.
Porque la imagen aquí es como un vehículo.
The image is a vehicle of expression. When Grand Poder, the Señor of Seville, comes along, battered, badly injured, dehumanized, but valiant, carrying the cross, he is like the man of sorrow. A hush follows over the crowd. They look at him as a mirror of their own inner selves, with their sorrow, their loneliness, their problems. Everyone can identify with him. It's like a balm, having a silent dialogue with him. And you can see thousands of people in profound silence.
Entonces, claro, al procesionar las imágenes a la calle,
carrying images into the street really brings them to the people, so that Christ, living or dead, and the Virgin, his mother, they're right there in the street with the Sevillano. It brings them together, all the people that are in the street, so close, so that surrounded by so much folklore and so much physical beauty, you open up emotionally and it really gets inside. You can make a connection, maybe stronger than in a temple or in the coldness of a church, because it hits you. You're experiencing it intensely.
This was the art that moved the people. More people, I believe, saw these processional sculptures in the 16th and 17th century than ever saw a painting by Velázquez or Murillo or any of the other artists that we now consider to be the great masters of Spanish Baroque art.
These incredibly lifelike figures are carved from wood. Unlike stone, marble, or clay, wood is a once living material that carries latent qualities of life. When clothed and carried into the streets, a magical transformation seems to take place. There is a legend about the great sculptor Martínez Montañez. He was overwhelmed upon seeing his own sculpture, Jesús de la Pasión, going through the street in procession. It was so lifelike, so real, he cried out in astonishment that it was impossible that he could have created such an image.
These sculptures were created by some of the greatest artists of the time. Not only Martínez Montañez, who is known as El Dios de la Madera, the god of wood, but also artists that are still considered to be the greatest artists of the 17th century in Spain. Pedro Roldán, Jerónimo Hernández, all of these artists that worked in Seville created processional sculptures, and some of them, like Juan de Mesa, even specialized in processional images.
There is still a great demand for processional sculpture in Seville. Images that are damaged or beginning to deteriorate after hundreds of years need to be restored. Sculptures destroyed by fire have to be remade. And contracts for new images from the new brotherhoods keep modern-day sculptors very busy. Manuel Carmona Martínez works out of his studio not far from the center of town.
Bueno, me vine a Sevilla muy joven, tendría aproximadamente unos 13 o 14 años.
When I came to Seville, I was very young, about 13 or 14 years old. I came to Seville because there wasn't much work in my village, and a lot of people were moving to the city, so I came here too. I hope to do something with my art because that's what I love. I wanted to be an artist. In Andalusia, religious sculpture has a lot of power, so almost all the artists here make their living with religious art.
Besides sculpture, there are studios of silversmithing, woodwork, and embroidery that operate year-round, doing work for the brotherhoods. José Manuel Elena Martín owns one of many embroidery studios in Seville. The thread they use is called plata dorada. It is fine silver thread plated with gold. The virgins are dressed in the style of 16th and 17th century Spanish queens. In fact, the queens of that period donated their garments to the images. They even gave them their crowns to wear. And that's how Sevillanos like to see their virgins, dressed like queens. Many people do not realize that underneath a virgin's robes is merely a wooden armature. The only sculpted parts are her face, neck, and hands. Fernando Abad Ortega, who has an antique shop near the cathedral, has been dressing the Virgin of the Brotherhood of Montesión for many years.
When I received the Virgin to dress her, women of the Brotherhood, her handmaidens, have already been with her. They're the ones who prepare her and put on her undergarments. They put on her petticoats, which they change from time to time. So when they bring her to me, her body is more or less covered. Then I begin to dress her. In some brotherhoods, they turn this dressing of the Virgin into a ritual. Not in some, but in almost all of them. They make it quite grand, pompous even. There are brotherhoods that send out invitations to see the dressing of the Virgin. In my case, I dress her pretty much alone.
Over 50 virgins go out into the streets of Seville during Semana Santa. But there is one who stands out among them all. There is one who is known as the Señora of Seville, La Macarena. This 17th century image boasts an entourage of 2,500 brothers, including an escort of hundreds of Roman soldiers. It takes 2 hours to watch the entire procession pass by.
Al cielo con ella. Al cielo con ella. Queremos ir todos los sevillanos. Madre mía, Macarena. Guapa. Reina de la madrugada. Reina de nuestros corazones, reina de Sevilla entera. ¡Viva de Santa!
Una saeta es un cante, es un rezo.
A saeta is a song, a prayer, and at the same time it's a flamenco form, one of the most difficult. The saeta seems to have originated in liturgical songs that were sung in church. Then came the flamenco artists who took these saetas and made them bigger. They made it pure flamenco. It's very pure and very difficult because it's sung in difficult conditions. A saeta is sung from a balcony without a microphone, without a guitar, or any accompaniment.
Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Es como una flecha, como un dardo.
It's like an arrow, a dart. That's what saeta means. It nails you in the heart.
The centuries go by. Haunting strains of a saeta drift through the night. Christ and the Virgin float over a sea of people. Bearing crosses and flickering candles, endless files of hooded penitents snake through the ancient streets of the city. a celebration of spring and the resurrection of Christ. Semana Santa in Seville.
Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Entre Naranjo y la cao. Ay, 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 y en mi Virgen de Hermoseo, agua, agua, perfume